There are loud songs. And then there are dangerous songs. Not dangerous because they scream at you. Dangerous because they slip into your brain quietly. And suddenly you're thinking about your life differently at 2 in the morning. Pink Floyd's Breathe in the Air is one of those songs. And before we get into this, if you're the kind of person who doesn't just listen to music, but disappears into it, you're in the right place. Because this is not just the story of a song. This is the story of a band slowly realizing they were making something much bigger than a rock album. And here's the real question underneath all of this. Did Pink Floyd quietly become one of the greatest bands of all time without people fully noticing it until it was too late? Because that debate gets very interesting once The Dark Side of the Moon enters the conversation. Now let me ask you something. When was the first time you actually heard Breathe? Not in the background, not while driving, not while someone else played it. I mean really heard it. Because for a lot of people, Breathe sneaks up on you. It's surrounded by bigger songs. Money, Time, Us and Them. Those are the tracks people mention first. But Breathe is the atmosphere that makes the entire album work. Without it, Dark Side of the Moon doesn't feel like a world. It just feels like a collection of songs. And that's the first thing people miss about Pink Floyd in the early 70s. They stopped thinking like a band making singles. They started thinking like filmmakers, architects, psychologists, almost. Now to understand Breathe, you have to understand where Pink Floyd actually was in 1972 and 1973. Because despite what history tells us now, Pink Floyd was not yet universally viewed as untouchable legends. Critics respected them. Fans were loyal, but they weren't yet operating at Beatles or Zeppelin level in the public imagination. That changes with Dark Side. And the strange thing is, the album almost feels too calm to become one of the biggest records ever made. Think about what dominates rock around this era. Led Zeppelin is massive. The Who are explosive. Deep Purple is loud. Glam rock is theatrical. And then Pink Floyd shows up with an album about anxiety, greed, time, pressure, death, mental collapse, and somehow turns it into one of the best-selling albums in history. That should not work commercially, but it does. And Breathe is the doorway into that experience. The song itself begins almost like waking up slowly. No rush, no explosive opening, just atmosphere. David Gilmour's guitar doesn't attack the listener. It floats. Richard Wright's keyboards don't push forward. They drift underneath everything like fog. And Roger Waters' lyrics? They sound comforting at first. Breathe, breathe in the air. Almost reassuring. But then the song starts revealing what it's actually talking about. Routine, conformity, the machine of everyday life. Run, rabbit, run. Now let's stop there for a second, because this is where Pink Floyd separates from most rock bands of the era. They weren't writing about rebellion the way other bands were. They were writing about psychological systems, pressure, expectation, mental exhaustion, and they were doing it quietly. That's much harder. Anybody can scream at an audience. Very few bands can hypnotize one. Now here's something most people don't know. Breathe actually existed in an earlier form before Dark Side of the Moon. Pink Floyd had used a version of it in a project called The Body, which was a soundtrack Roger Waters and Ron Geesin worked on for a documentary about the human body. That earlier version was rougher, less emotionally complete, but the DNA was there. And that matters because Pink Floyd didn't usually build songs the way other bands did. They evolved material slowly. Live performances changed songs. Studio experimentation changed songs. Conceptual themes reshape songs, which means Breathe wasn't written in one magical afternoon. It became itself over time. Now let's talk about the recording process, because this is where things get obsessive. Dark Side of the Moon was recorded primarily at Abbey Road Studios. Yes, that Abbey Road. And by this point, recording technology had evolved enough that bands could become perfectionists in ways earlier groups couldn't. Pink Floyd took full advantage of that. The tape loops, the transitions, the heartbeat effects, the spoken word interview clips throughout the album, all carefully built. Now here's the key detail. The band had already been testing much of the material live before recording the final album. That's unusual compared to modern recording. They were essentially road testing psychology, watching how audiences reacted, adjusting pacing, adjusting transitions. So by the time Dark Side hits the studio, they already know the emotional flow works. And then there's David Gilmour. Let me ask you this. Is there a more emotionally precise guitarist in rock history? Not fastest, not flashiest, precise. Because Gilmour's playing on Breathe isn't technically aggressive. but every note feels intentional. Every bend feels placed exactly where it needs to be. Now here's something interesting. A lot of technically advanced guitarists in the 70s were trying to impress audiences. Gilmour often did the opposite. He slowed things down, left space, and that restraint becomes one of Pink Floyd's greatest weapons. Because silence creates tension, space creates mood, and Breathe lives inside space. Now let's talk about Roger Waters for a second, because this song has his fingerprints all over it philosophically. Waters was becoming increasingly focused on alienation, disconnection, the feeling that modern life slowly turns people into machines without them realizing it. And if you look ahead at Pink Floyd's future albums, Animals, The Wall, you can see these themes expanding more aggressively later. But Breathe is subtler. It almost whispers the warning instead of shouting it. And maybe that's why it hits harder with age. Because when you're younger, it sounds relaxing. When you're older, it sounds terrifying. Now here's another thing people miss about Dark Side of the Moon. The sequencing is genius. Not just the songs, the order. Because Speak to Me and Breathe don't feel separated. They feel connected biologically. Heartbeat into consciousness, panic into awareness. And once Breathe starts, the listener settles into the world of the album without realizing how deeply they've already entered it. That's not an accident. That's psychological pacing. And then there's the success itself. This album becomes a monster, not immediately explosive, but relentless. It stays on the Billboard charts for years. Years. And here's the crazy part. Pink Floyd themselves reportedly didn't fully realize how massive it was becoming while it happened. Because unlike Beatlemania, this wasn't hysteria. It was absorption. People lived with this album. Dorm rooms, headphones, late-night drives, and yes, chemically enhanced listening sessions. Let's be honest about it. Dark Side of the Moon became one of the defining experience albums of all time. Not because of marketing, because people emotionally attached themselves to it. Now let's get into the real debate. Did Pink Floyd become a top 3 rock band of all time? Because once Dark Side enters the picture, the argument changes. The Beatles changed popular music forever. Led Zeppelin defined hard rock excess and power. But Pink Floyd? Pink Floyd built emotional environments unlike anyone else. And Breathe is a perfect example. It's not trying to dominate you. It's trying to absorb you. That's different. Now think about influence. How many modern artists build atmosphere the way Pink Floyd did? How many albums try to feel continuous? How many bands prioritize emotional immersion over singles? That influence is everywhere now. Films, ambient music, progressive rock, electronic music. Even hip-hop producers cite Dark Side for pacing and mood building. And it all traces back to songs like Breathe, quiet songs, patient songs, songs that trust the listener. Now here's something ironic. For a band associated with massive live spectacles later, Breathe is deeply intimate. It doesn't sound like an arena. It sounds like someone sitting beside you at 2 a.m. telling you life moves faster than you think it does. And maybe that's why it lasts. Because underneath all the production, all the mythology, all the smoke and lights, the song is painfully human. So let me ask you something. What's more impressive? A song that grabs you instantly, or a song that slowly becomes part of your life over decades? Because Breathe doesn't usually hit hardest the first time you hear it. It grows, and that's much rarer. Pink Floyd understood something a lot of bands never did. Sometimes the quietest songs leave the deepest mark, and Breathe proves it. Not with force, not with speed, not with volume, but with atmosphere, tension, patience, and truth. And honestly, that may be exactly why Pink Floyd belongs in the greatest band conversation. Not because they were the loudest band, because they created worlds people never fully wanted to leave. So now I want to ask you, where do you rank Pink Floyd? Top 10? Top 5? Top 3? And does Dark Side of the Moon change the argument completely? Drop it in the comments. I want to know where you stand on this debate. And if you're just here to drift through one of the greatest sonic landscapes ever recorded, relax and spark one up. And keep that turntable spinning.